All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice of the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however infinitesimal, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. I would like to welcome you all to the second event of the USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice for the 2021-22 academic year, where tonight we will learn with Dr. Rachel Gross, who I will introduce more fully shortly. My name is Oren Kroll-Zeldin, and I am the Assistant Director of the SWIG program. Let me begin first by thanking a number of people for their support for making this event possible. First of all, I'd like to thank all the SWIG JSSJ faculty and staff for helping make this event possible, especially our director, Aaron Hahn Tapper, and our rabbi in residence, Camille Shira Angel. Thank you also to our amazing program assistant, Victoria Farlow. I want to take a brief moment to tell you about the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Founded in 1977, our program is the first Jewish Studies chair or program at a Catholic university anywhere in the world. In 2008, we were reestablished as the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, making it the first academic program worldwide to formally link Jewish studies with social justice. Including a minor in this field, in the classroom, the program offers a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses not found in other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer extraordinary events that are free and open to the public, such as tonight's event. Let me tell you about our two remaining events for this semester. On October 24th, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. via Zoom, we will learn with Marcella White Campbell, who will deliver the 7th annual SWIG JSSJ program Human Rights Lecture, followed by a conversation between her and Rabbi Camille Angel. Titled Racial Justice in 21st Century America, Jews, People of Color, and Multiculturalism, White Campbell will speak about the imperative for racial justice in 21st century America in the Jewish communities and beyond, from her vantage point as the new executive director of Bechol Lashon, a not-for-profit educational organization strengthening Jewish identity by raising awareness about the ethnic, racial, and cultural diversity of Jewish communities and experiences. The final JSSJ event of the semester, which will also be held on Zoom, will be on Tuesday, November 16th at 5:30 p.m. Titled The Visual is Political, Citizen Videography and Documentary Cinema in Israel-Palestine, this event attempts to address the following. How is oppression represented on screen in Israel-Palestine? What can we learn from both cinema and everyday videos filmed on cell phones and camcorders about how power structures the visual field in the Middle East, how the visual in turn impacts the political, and how resistance is embedded in people's self-representation of their lives? This talk brings together Professors Shirley Bahar from Columbia University and Liat Berdugo of USF, two scholars and artists who study the moving image in Israel and Palestine, both of whom have recently published groundbreaking scholarly books on the subject. If you'd like to learn more about these events or our program in general, please visit the link which we'll drop into the chat shortly, and we will add you to our mailing list. Through the SWIG JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better. paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or another social identity altogether. Now, let me formally introduce tonight's speaker. Rachel B. Gross is Assistant Professor and John and Marcia Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. She is a religious studies scholar who studies 20th and 21st century American Jews. Her book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, about which she will speak tonight, received an honorable mention for the 2021 Saul Vianier Book Prize, which is given by the American Jewish Historical Society. She has also written about the philanthropic organization PJ Library, the first American Jewish children's cookbook, and the Jewish history of Crisco. She's currently working on a religious biography of the 20th century Jewish writer, Mary Antin. Let me say briefly, before turning it over to Dr. Gross, that her book, right here, it's here somewhere, and it's very, very good. I read a lot of academic books and scholarly books, and I can very honestly and sincerely say that Beyond the Synagogue is one of the best academic books I've read in a very, very long time. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Gross to USF. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Oren. Thank you to Oren for and Aaron Hahn-Tapper for inviting me to speak tonight. I am genuinely so glad to have such wonderful colleagues in Jewish studies in San Francisco. San Francisco and the Bay Area in general are really exciting places to do the work of Jewish studies, and I'm so glad to be partners in this work of thinking about Jews and Judaism and Jewishness in new ways with colleagues at USF. And thank you again to Victoria Farlow for doing the work of making this event happen. And I especially want to welcome any students who are here. I know you're busy people, and I really appreciate your time and your attention. I am a religious studies professor, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For me, it means asking questions about how people make meaning in their lives. Like many other religious studies scholars, I think of one of the goals of religious studies as making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. I work particularly on the latter half of that phrase, making the familiar strange. And that is, much of my work is analyzing everyday activities that we might take for granted. And I think about the ways that we tell stories about ourselves, our families, our communities through everyday activities, and the ways that we ask weighty existential questions like, who am I and where do I come from? I think these are ordinary identity questions, but the fact that they're ordinary and that we ask them all the time should not make them less remarkable. I'm gonna share my screen and great. There we are. That's my book, as Oren mentioned, and nobody should feel obliged to buy it. But if you do, as one of my teachers says, please do not pay retail. Please use the coupon code, which Oren has helpfully put in the chat as well. I want to begin diving in with one of my favorite ordinary moments from my research on American Jewish nostalgia. Back in the day when we could freely go places, go to museums, I watched the visitors to the museum at Eldridge Street sit down in the pews of the beautifully restored 1887 Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side. They listened to a docent recount the history of the grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jewish immigrants. When the docent finished, as she led the group out of the sanctuary, the docent paused at the back of the room. "Step into the floorboards," she said. And soon people had arranged themselves into straight lines. Pointing to the pattern of indentations on the floor, she said, "Why do you think these are here?" And slowly the group realized that they stood literally in the footprints of former male congregants. The indentations had been made by men shuffling, rocking back and forth in front of their pew as they prayed in the traditional Jewish fashion. Over the years, they had left their mark in the soft pine floorboards. The docent demonstrated the movement and others copied her. A few tourists were familiar with the rocking motion from their own synagogue services. Most of them shuffled awkwardly, if enthusiastically. And standing in the footprints of former congregants provides an immediate sensory connection to the past, one that engages visitors' whole bodies. The experience is a highlight for many tourists. One wrote on Yelp, "You can literally feel the history at your feet." The docent's careful orchestration of this moment helps visitors to experience a connection to past congregants physically and emotionally. In my book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, I look at the materials and the institutions through which American Jews engage, promote, and teach nostalgia for turn of the 20th century Jewish immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. And I found that nostalgia, which I think of as a sentimental longing for Jewish communal origins that cannot be fulfilled, nostalgia can be both an emotion and a practice. As a feeling and a practice, nostalgia has become a prominent part of American Jewish religion from the 1970s into the present day. I look at 4 case studies, the materials and institutions of Jewish genealogists, historic synagogues that are used as museums, children's books and dolls, and artisanal delis and other Jewish food sites. That's Saul's Deli here in Berkeley, here in the Bay Area. I find that some of these materials encourage American Jews to feel nostalgia for a particular story about Ashkenazi history, the history of Jews whose ancestors come from Central and Eastern Europe, and that nostalgia is best understood as part of American Jewish religion. This requires us to expand our understanding of what counts as religious practice and where we look for religious activities. So what I'm going to do in the rest of our time together is think about what kind of nostalgia I'm talking about and what we mean by nostalgia, and also what I mean by religion, because I'm using that word in a very particular way. I'm going to trace the historical development of American Jewish nostalgia as I see it, the forms it takes, the places where I see it happening. And I'll wrap up by thinking about one of the implications of taking this kind of nostalgia seriously as religious practice. I think it shows us, against the arguments of some very worried Jewish community leaders, that American Judaism is not in decline, as they would have it, but actually is evolving and flourishing. So in looking at the work of genealogists, historic synagogues, children's books, and delis, what I'm doing is studying material culture. And that's an academic term for physical stuff, because if academics can use 2 words, material culture, rather than one, stuff, we will. I'm interested in the ways that certain types of material culture, the ways that certain types of stuff is used to teach or induce or convey nostalgic longing for particular Jewish stories as a fundamentally significant way of being Jewish. So Jews in many times and many places have used physical goods, have used stuff to create Jewish spaces and Jewish communities. But I think that the stuff and the institutions of nostalgia do more than connect American Jews to other Jews in the present. They provide sacred meaning that places individuals in relation to past, present, and future Jewish communities as well. I think that religion is best understood as meaningful relationships and the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support these relationships. So when I'm thinking about religion, I'm thinking about important relationships, sacred relationships, not just the stuff that we might do at synagogue or at church or whatever. In thinking about religion as relationships, I'm building on the work of a religious studies scholar named Robert Orsi, who describes religion as networks of relationships among the living, between the living and the dead, or between humans and the divine. And we can emphasize these different relationships in different ways and at different times. My teacher, the religious studies scholar Catherine Lofton, says, whatever else religion might be, it is a way of describing the structures by which we are bound or connected to one another. Bound or connected to one another. I like that a lot. Understanding religion as relationships and the structures that bind helps us think about the ways that families and communities and memories are central to religious activity. And thinking about our relationships with families and communities and ancestors and the divine as at the center of religion helps us also think about how people who don't see themselves as religious, right? I'm not religious, people might say, they still make meaning in their lives. They still have sacred relationships of all kinds. And I want to ask, how do they and how do traditionally religious people, how do all of these folks find meaning outside of traditional religious practices, guided by a variety of supposedly secular institutions and supposedly secular stuff? And this image on the screen is a collage of family photographs of the writer and artist Sheldon Oberman, which I'll come back to. His family very nicely let me use it. American Jews create and engage with nostalgia through materials and institutions that invoke a community that includes both the living and the dead, and that provides meaning in the present by telling stories about the past, which are two really important things that happen in religious activity. Nostalgia for Ashkenazi immigration history, which I'll be talking about tonight, also is related to traditional forms of Jewish memory and emotion. Jews traditionally sit around the Passover table in their family tables in the spring on the holiday of Passover at the home ritual of the Seder, and they say, we too should feel as if we had been freed from Egypt. That's a traditional line, that they should feel as if they themselves came out of, that they participated in the biblical exodus from Egypt, that places them in the history or in the mythology. But thinking about nostalgia as an American Jewish religious practice also helps us think about how American Jews build on those traditional practices and how they make meaning in their lives beyond them. So the tourists at the museum at Eldridge Street did not just happen to arrive at that historic synagogue on the Lower East Side and place their feet in the grooves of long ago congregants. American Jews have seen the Lower East Side neighborhood in Lower Manhattan in New York as a site of authentic emotional connection to communal history for a very long time. American Jewish history in the Americas dates back to the earliest years of European colonialism, but the majority of American Jews are descendants from folks who came to the United States from Central and Eastern Europe between about 1880 and 1924. Many of them settled on New York's Lower East Side and other urban immigrant neighborhoods. In the early to mid 20th century, they began to move their families out of these crowded neighborhoods for more spacious parts of the city and suburbs. But they kept thinking about the old neighborhood, and some kept coming back. In the early 20th century, those Jews who had left the Lower East Side were replaced continually by new arrivals until the US Congress severely limited immigration in 1924. Leaping ahead to the 1970s and 1980s, what scholars call a white ethnic revival encouraged many Americans to turn their attention to their ancestries. And American Jews thought about their former urban ethnic neighborhoods with nostalgic longing. As they did so, American Jews reflected together on this history in a number of different ways. In the mid-1970s, inspired by the African-American roots movement of that era, which was named for Alex Haley's 1976 book, Roots, an imaginative history of an American family, American Jewish genealogists, building on the work of African Americans, began to organize and educate themselves. They wrote manuals and created Jewish genealogical societies. A decade later, in the 1980s, historians and preservationists started paying attention in earnest to the role that historic synagogues might play in Jewish public life. This is from the restoration of the Eldridge Street Synagogue. In the 1990s, mainstream publishing houses started publishing a larger and larger number of children's books depicting Jewish immigration as part of the American story of multiculturalism that they wanted to introduce into classrooms in the 90s. And in the early 21st century, the Eastern European Jewish culinary revival began in earnest with the appearance of new artisanal delis and other businesses created by Jewish food entrepreneurs. American Jews could connect to this past and other Jewish histories through a variety of older types of Jewish institutions and media, such as passively watching a movie or a live performance of Fiddler on the Roof. And I think that GIF is probably getting annoying, so we will move ahead. But I think that the new materials that I'm looking at encourage a more active longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history. Longing activates agency beyond the passive connection of watching Fiddler on the Roof. Jewish genealogists actively research their family histories. Visitors at historic synagogues step into the footprints of past congregants, literally and metaphorically. Parents read illustrated books aloud and encourage children to play with toys that tell a particular story. And restaurant patrons literally consume their longing for Eastern European Jewish history. So some forms of nostalgic pop culture are accessible for audiences of all ages, like those catchy tunes, memorable dances, and iconic images of Fiddler on the Roof. But others are specifically designed for children of certain ages and often their parents. The institutions that create and distribute children's books are not normally thought of as public history. Public history are the programs and institutions like museums that teach history to a broad public. But I think nostalgic children's books help parents to pride, sorry, you can see my messages. I need to figure out I'm working on how to connect with my iPad, sorry. Children's books aren't normally thought of as public history, but nostalgic children's books help parents to prime children to understand a certain emotional reaction to particular Jewish histories, such as an American Jewish value. I spoke to an executive editor at Scholastic Press, which is the press that produces highlights for children. And Diane Hess, this editor at Scholastic, which also has published, who herself has published many Jewish children's books, told me most kids don't have any Jewish background now and don't have that nostalgia for the immigrant grandparents. And for me, it's like you can't lose that because that's sort of the glue that's been holding the culture together. Children's books about Jewish history help place Jewish children and their parents within family stories and broader communal networks. So the fact that we're buying and selling children's books actually inspires nostalgic longing and helps folks pass it from one generation to the next. So just like we don't normally think about children's books as forms of public history, like museums, restaurants are also not normally thought of as sites of public history. But I think actually restaurants also are an important place where we shape emotional reactions to particular histories. The immediacy of eating encourages us to ask and answer questions about our self, our identity, our community, And I think certain types of Jewish restaurants encourage patrons to share their family stories. When I spoke to Elise Lerner, who was the owner of On Rye, a since closed deli in Washington, D.C., she told me a lot of people come in and they want to tell us their experiences that they've had with this food growing up. And a lot of restaurateurs and purveyors of Jewish food themselves tell stories of their family histories and of Jewish communal histories through their food, the decor of the restaurant, and their presentation. And like all sites of public history, just like museums, these restaurants have a particular point of view. Karen Edelman, the co-owner of Saul's Deli over in Berkeley, told me that the principal story told in Saul's Deli is that of Ashkenazi Jews from the old world, and then they go to New York, and then they continue going west until they reach California, which makes Saul's Deli and its patrons the peak of Jewish history, which I just love so much. I love that it makes Berkeley and the customers at Saul's the center of Jewish history. So nostalgia places individuals and communities within an emotionally resonant historical story. Now, these new forms of Jewish, oh, there's Saul's. These new forms of American Jewish public history often involve thinking critically about the past and about the effect of the past on the present. They can challenge who we think of as an authority on Jewish history, identity, and practice. I, as a Jewish history professor, am not actually the authority on what's going on necessarily in a restaurant. The Jewish culinary revivalists I study are deliberately making American Jewish food fit for the 21st century. They are reimagining traditional dishes from Eastern Europe that were developed in the United States, and they're reimagining this Jewish Eastern European cuisine in light of concerns about sustainability, reliance on local goods, and the slow food movement, as well as how customers are going to emotionally react to it. So when Karen Edelman and Peter Levitt bought Saul's Deli in Berkeley from its founding owners, many of the restaurant's ingredients were shipped from New York to Berkeley. Now, Peter and Karen were participating in the Bay Area's food movement. Peter had previously worked at the famous Chez Panisse in Berkeley, which spearheaded the Bay Area's food movement. And they were like, this is not acceptable. We cannot keep shipping our food from New York. So they worked to reshape their menu with local and seasonal ingredients. They worked to honor Ashkenazi American cuisine by elevating it. But, and this is one of my favorite stories, they ran into a pickle problem. So you might not know, unless you're a pickle aficionado, that a half sour pickle should be properly made from a fresh cucumber, and it should be eaten 6 to 20 days after you pickle it. After that, it is no longer a half sour pickle. It is you probably have a full sour pickle on your hands. So Levitt and Edelman wanted to serve pickles made from local cucumbers grown between June and November, but deli customers actually expect to have a half sour pickle all year round. So for a while, customers at Saul's had to endure having half sour pickles alongside their sandwiches at Saul's only in seasonally appropriate months, along with lessons in agriculture, geography, and Jewish culinary history. As you can imagine, this was a hard lesson for some customers to swallow, so to speak. And actually, I think the experiment did not succeed. I think they gave in to customers on this one. I want to suggest that these folks who are selling and creating nostalgic American Jewish public history, who are deliberately working to create community around particular items of Jewish public history, should be considered a kind of Jewish communal leader or even a religious expert. We actually don't normally think about Jewish genealogists, museum staff members, children's book authors, and restaurateurs as religious leaders. But I think that all of those folks create and curate the materials designed to solicit particular emotional and religious reactions to particular Jewish histories. They are Jews, again, who aren't usually recognized as leaders or experts in Jewish communal conversations. they don't necessarily see themselves as Jewish communal leaders. Often, actually, staff members at these kind of organizations deliberately minimize their own impacts. They want to tell their patrons that you're the expert. You come into this space and you're the expert in order to get their patrons buy-in. So if we do the work of acknowledging these folks as leaders, we can help figure out the importance of these new types of Jewish communal organizations. We can think about how they're guiding American Jews at least as much as those whose leadership has been recognized throughout most of the 20th century. Folks like rabbis and directors of Jewish federations, American Zionist organizations, and other Jewish nonprofits. In fact, looking at the practices of nostalgia might help us further break down binaries between religious leaders and lay practitioners, folks who are not clergy. I love this fact about genealogists, that the authoritative genealogist can be either a professional or an amateur genealogist. If you research your own genealogy, you're generally an amateur genealogist. And if you research somebody else's genealogy for pay, you're usually a professional genealogist. So those terms don't always mean what we would expect them to mean. And as I spoke to Jewish genealogists, I learned that while much of the leadership of non-Jewish genealogy organizations have genealogy certifications, Jewish genealogical society leaders usually don't. And instead, community members in these genealogy communities confer respect on those whose research they deem legitimate and substantive. So authoritative Jewish genealogists are those who uphold communal standards while honoring their family histories by researching and memorializing them through physical and digital records, telling stories, saying Kaddish, the Jewish mourner's prayer, among other practices that create these physical and emotional connections to Jewish family and communal histories. Now, just because I think that these folks should be recognized as religious leaders does not mean that everybody listens to them uncritically. That's a position with which other religious leaders are definitely familiar. Lots of people don't listen to rabbis. At sites of public history, docents and staff members at historic synagogues provide all kinds of rules of acceptable behavior to visitors. If you've ever been to a museum, you probably know there are rules about do's and don'ts, how you behave in this space. But at Jewish historic spaces, as I observed in my research, Jewish visitors approach Jewish historic spaces with a sense of entitlement. They think that this is my space and I know how to act in it. And that's something that staff members want to encourage, even as they're trying to regulate their behavior. So for instance, at the Jewish Museum of Florida, which is in 2 historic synagogue buildings in South Beach, the South Beach neighborhood of Miami Beach, so very happening area. This museum encourages visitors and donors' sense of authority over their space through its wonderful former advertising slogan, whether your family came here 100 years ago or today, this museum is about you and for you. So I love this because it's not clear who the you is, right? Do you have to be Jewish or Floridian or American to be the you? And what happens when visitors' ideas of the past differ from staff members' visions? The museum intentionally leaves all these questions unasked and unanswered so visitors can fill in their own answers. Jewish deli owners also run into issues with customers with differing ideas about what they should be doing. Jewish deli owners routinely told me that customers constantly compare restaurants outside New York to their ideal of a New York deli, even if the customers haven't actually been to a New York deli in years, if ever. And even if the restaurateurs repeatedly say, this isn't a New York deli, we're not trying to be a New York deli. At Saul's Deli, Peter and Karen explained to customers, recreating the New York deli is not our charge. Food, authenticity, flavor, sustainability, survival, and being true to the values of our culinary roots are our first priority. So like other folks who I think of as Jewish culinary revivalists, Peter and Karen are attempting to shift their customers' ideas of what's authentic from emulating this ideal place, this imaginary New York past, to new narratives about Jewish food, history, and memory. So what they're doing here is engaging in and pushing back against nostalgia, a particular nostalgic idea of Jewish food. Nostalgia is a norm. It encourages the most simplistic, streamlined visions of any story. The nostalgic longing of American Jews for stories of Eastern European immigration at the turn of the century, and beyond that for Eastern European past, deliberately centers Ashkenazi Jewish experiences and marginalizes other stories. So American Jewish genealogists might find that they have diverse backgrounds, but I've found that many are drawn to family stories of Eastern European immigrants that fit the dominant narrative, the story I've been telling you. And by necessity, the materials and practices of nostalgia have to exclude certain people and certain stories. If you're going to tell a simplistic and emotional story, you have to leave people out. And sometimes other stories are folded into it. So the menu at Shawl's Deli happens to offer a number of dishes from Middle Eastern cuisine, inspired by Jewish past in the Middle East. So serving selective Middle Eastern dishes actually allows Shawl's to serve more vegan and vegetarian entrees, which is so important for a restaurant in Berkeley, but can also be challenging for a Jewish deli, which is a cuisine really focused on meat. So Karen and Peter told me broadening that story a little bit is a sidestep that's a little inclusive of both more Jewish pasts and more customers, and it allows Shawl's to continue to tell the story of Jewish cultures and Jewish food beyond the monolithic narrative of Ashkenazi American food. But at the same time, I also want to note that this very inclusion literally folds non-Ashkenazi Jewish histories into the story of Ashkenazi nostalgia. So the side dish might be Middle Eastern, but the larger platter and the deli itself remains focused on Central and Eastern European heritage. So it raises the question, what happens when we fold other people's histories or try to be inclusive, and what are the best ways to be inclusive of diverse histories? So let's see. I want to tell you one more story, and then I am going to wrap up. So today, a lot of nostalgic children's books are among those that are distributed in the catalog of an organization called PJ Library. PJ Library distributes free children's books and music with Jewish content to Jewish and interfaith families in North America and to some extent in other places. And if you have a child who is Jewish or in a Jewish family, you can sign them up and you will start getting free monthly books, more than you want probably. The organization really emphasizes that these books that they're sending out are not just for children, but are meant to be read aloud by older family members who, like children, should be receptive to their messages about Jewish history and values. So PJ Library members, staff members say we're not a religious program, but instead they explicitly want to have an effect on families' values and practices, including remembering certain aspects of Jewish history, like turn of the century Jewish immigration history. So I would call them religious. I have called them religious in print, as a matter of fact. And in fact, anecdotal and quantitative evidence suggests that they are having a really significant influence on Jewish and interfaith families in North America. I happen to think they're the most important Jewish organization in North America, though for some reason I am the only person to say so far. One of the books that they distribute is a book called The Always Prayer Shawl, which is written by Sheldon Oberman. I showed you his family bulletin board earlier. This beautiful book tells the story of a boy's immigration from Eastern Europe to North America. Oberman was Canadian, but he made the story generically North American to appeal to readers in the United States, which my Canadian friends tell me is a very Canadian thing to do. The boy brings with him his grandfather's prayer shawl, which he eventually passes on to his own grandson. And though the Always Prayer shawl tells the particular story of Jewish immigration, it in fact comes out of Oberman's experience inheriting his grandfather's prayer shawl and giving a prayer shawl to his son. Oberman encourages audiences of all backgrounds to find themselves in the story of heirlooms and intergenerational connections. So what we see here is that the story of Jewish immigration, of Jewish nostalgia, is so important, is so widespread, that it becomes a model for other peoples. Oberman frequently wore his grandfather's real prayer shawl while reading the book aloud to audiences, expanding the religious use of the garment. So he's reading it like at school readings, you know, and when a non-Jewish author compliments him at a reading of his book, she says, "I wish I could tell stories like you." And he responds by placing the prayer shawl around her shoulders and saying, "Yes, you can, you can do it." That amazing moment. So the prayer shawl and Oberman's story kind of comfortably incorporate Jews and non-Jews into the emotions and network of North American Jewish nostalgia. So American Jewish nostalgia is this kind of religious practice for Jews, and I want to suggest for non-Jews too. I'm gonna wrap up by thinking about how nostalgic activities such as touring the museum at Eldridge Street or buying a pastrami sandwich at a deli, and thinking about all of these activities as religious practices helps us respond to the claims of Jewish leaders and sociologists who see Jewish religion on the decline in the United States. So since the mid-20th century, American Jewish communal leaders have worried very loudly that American Jews' religiosity is decreasing. They sometimes describe this as assimilation into mainstream American culture. What we have here is Look magazine's famous 1964 cover story about the vanishing American Jew. This is a non-Jewish magazine proclaiming that American Jews are vanishing. In recent decades, Jewish community leaders have worried about the effects of intermarriage, marriage with non-Jews, in what has been called a marriage crisis or a continuity crisis. So lots of folks worried about American Jews disappearing, and it's closely tied for them to ideas about American Jews becoming less religious. So the folks who have these worries, congregational rabbis, sociologists, tend to have really limited ideas about what religion is. They're thinking about synagogue attendance, they're thinking about observing holidays and life cycles. And they're quantitative sociologists who are doing these studies that are leading to these proclamations, tend to have definitions of religion they want to define religion in ways they can measure. They're going to think about things that you can check off on a survey or not check off, as the case may be. They're thinking about attending synagogue, keeping kosher Jewish dietary laws, or sending children to Jewish religious schools. The most recent national study of American Jews by the Pew Research Center came out in March. It was Jewish Americans in 2020. They did the study in 2020, but it just came out in 2021. It came out in May. This study comes out of that legacy. This study, like their 2013 study, divides American Jews into what they call Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. So Jews by religion are the folks who say, yes, my current religion is Jewish. And according to Pew, 27% of Jewish adults 27% of Jewish adults do not identify their religion as Jewish, but do consider themselves Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background. I don't love this. I don't love this division of Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. I don't find that useful. I think that American Jews, like other Americans, just aren't very good at naming religion in their lives. The division between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, and these related worries about the decline of American Jewish religion, are incorrectly identifying the ways that Jews think about and practice Judaism in the United States. When Jewish communal leaders and sociologists are distinguishing between Jewish culture and Jewish religion, a lot of the ways that American Jews are creating meaning in their lives as individuals, as families, and as communities are flattened or even erased. I think that many of the fears about Jewish assimilation into general Americanism resist the idea that Judaism, like all human activity, has and will always change over time. This is the basic lesson of studying history. Things change over time. These fears rely on the idea of a static Judaism, one that doesn't change, and a static American culture. And they see them as mutually exclusive rather than as things that respond to one another. So we typically think about the activities of American Jewish nostalgia as leisure activities, and for participants, they can take up as much time and money as one allows. You can do a quick search of family history on ancestry.com in some spare time. You can pursue Jewish genealogy as a serious researcher over many decades, contributing to local, national, and international Jewish genealogical forums or databases and organizations. You can devote your life to Jewish deli, or you can pop into a deli for a quick pastrami sandwich. But I think that the fact that nostalgia might recede into the background of an American Jew's life only to reappear repeatedly in different contexts actually points to its role in structuring individual experiences into broader stories, broader narratives of meaning. That's what religion does. Religion helps place our individual experiences into broader stories that make sense of our lives. So recognizing the dynamic pleasure, desires, practices, and play of American Jewish nostalgia, thinking about all of that as religious practices, helps us think about the wide variety of ways that American Jews and other Americans find sacred meaning in their lives beyond traditional religious structures, beyond traditional denominations, in institutions and in practices that we generally think of as secular. Redefining American Jewish religion expands where we see Americans finding meaning and in which institutions we think of as most powerful in their lives. Americans are shaped by norms and values articulated not only by their synagogues, their churches, their mosques, and their temples, but also by restaurants, publishing companies, toy manufacturers, gift shops, museums, and philanthropic organizations, which teach them not only how to behave, but also how to feel. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop there, and I absolutely welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This was extraordinarily interesting and fun. And I should say to those of you who found this to be interesting, this is just a taste of what is in this remarkable book, which tells more interesting stories, not more interesting stories than what it was told today, but a larger number of interesting stories that are also fascinating. And so I highly recommend you buy and read the book, but don't pay full retail price. Use the code. After reading this book, really sort of held back from asking you a whole lot of questions because I knew we were going to have this opportunity to talk. So before I get to some of the questions that are here, and if you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will try to get to them. So I want to ask a couple questions first. I want to say, first of all, thank you for writing this book and doing this research, because it is valuable in terms of researchers for opening up space to understand in a different way where religion in the United States happens. So, for example, if someone wanted to do research about how American Jewish religion might take place at a rock concert, there's now this sort of conversation already taking place that we need to look in religion in new and different places. So I'm grateful to you for that. And also it's useful for students who are thinking about the diversity of Jewish life, Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish religious practice, because it points to new ways and new directions of thinking about where does Judaism happen in the United States. So I guess I would like to start by asking you about this opening space for this diversity, and you alluded to this. Most of the work that you were doing and talking about is about Ashkenazi Jews and about the Ashkenazi Jewish experience, and how that necessarily, in telling a dominant narrative, marginalizes others. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the non-Ashkenazi experience, about Sephardi, Mizrahi, or other Jewish identities, how nostalgia plays into their religious practice in America, and how perhaps they react to going to, say, Saul's Deli and seeing a side dish being part of the main dish that is Ashkenazi.
Thank you so much for that reflection, Oren, and for that question. And I am so excited for your forthcoming work on how we might see rock concerts as religious. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you in that way. So Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, are they nostalgic, and how? I think that's such a good question. And I don't have the answer, because I spent all this time writing a book about Ashkenazi Jews. And some of the pushback I've gotten sometimes from folks is, hey, aren't you participating in, aren't I participating in marginalizing these folks, right? I spent all this time working on Ashkenazi Jews, just telling their story and not telling the stories of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews and other folks. And, I think that's such a good point. And what I hope is, what I think about my book as, I think an important part of recognizing marginalization is recognizing what's the big story that's being told, right? In order to make room for other stories, we first have to stop and recognize, what is it we're doing? What is the big story that's being told, and who is it, in what ways is it working, and who is it leaving out? So I think of this book as telling the big story of Ashkenazi American nostalgia, and hoping that it opens the door and encourages other people to do the work of figuring out nostalgia in Sephardi and Mizrahi communities. I think I'm 100% sure that there is nostalgia in Sephardi and Mizrahi communities in many different ways. And in fact, those are umbrella terms for communities, Jews from many different places, each of whom might be nostalgic for their own homelands in different ways. What I think is different is that Ashkenazi Jews, Ashkenazi American Jews, have these big institutions that are telling nostalgic stories and reinforcing nostalgic stories in a particular way. And I don't think that Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in the United States have those big institutions of nostalgia yet. I might or might not be a good thing for them to develop them, but they're not there yet. And I do think that they often, and Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews often end up participating in Ashkenazi nostalgia, that this stuff is so inescapable, right? They end up going to delis and being told this is what Jewish food looks like. They end up consuming children's books and just being told the story of Eastern European Jewish immigration to the United States and being told this is what American Judaism looks like. So to some extent, they have to become fluent in this story. And to some extent, some of these Sephardi and Mizrahi folks that I've talked to do say, look, this story emotionally matters to us because we're Jewish, and this is one important American Jewish story. But we would also like to take the next step and tell our own stories in different ways. And I think that work is beginning to be done, and I'm so excited to continue to follow it.
Excellent. Me too. I'm curious to know, so on a similar but different vein, is a sort of a question about gender in terms of who is doing this work of nostalgia and of telling these stories, men, women, non-binary, who's doing it, why are they doing it, and how does gender play into it?
Thank you for that question. So who's doing it? And I think everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing nostalgia. Sometimes when I talk about studying these nostalgic institutions, folks say, oh, that's women's work, right? That ladies do that, right? They might think of genealogy really dismissively as the work of old women. And I will say, actually, a large number of genealogists are on the older side because it can be an all-consuming activity and retirees have time for it. It also takes money if you're doing it in a really engaged way. But it is done by men and women. And when I really interestingly, so it's done by men and women, absolutely. Like genealogy is just hugely popular with people of all genders. And what I found among Jewish genealogists is that they have responded to my work differently, actually, that male Jewish genealogists, not all men, but some have responded to my work, and they haven't loved the way I'm really emphasizing the emotion in their work. But the women are really receptive to what I'm naming. And they have told me, we think you're naming, some of them have told me, we think you're naming something about the emotional and religious importance of our work. But I think also gender plays out in all of these institutions and all of these activities in the same way that gender plays out, in American society in general. So when I'm looking at artisanal delis, for instance, the restaurant world is dominated by men in a lot of ways. And when we do see women owning artisanal delis, they're usually co-owners with men, because that happens to be right now the way the restaurant world works. So the fact is, gender is working in all kinds of complicated ways, but it's the same kind of complicated ways that we see it working in the United States in general. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, I want to ask you one more question before we get to a bunch of the questions that we have here. You made a very bold claim, and you said you may be the only person who believes this, that PJ Library is the most important, if I understood correctly, most important Jewish organization in North America today. Can you qualify that and explain why?
So, thank you for asking that. I love nothing more than to talk about PJ Library and why it's important. I am to date, I'm actually really proud of this. I think the first and I think to date the only scholar to have published a book chapter, a piece of scholarly writing on PJ Library. And I don't understand why everyone isn't writing about them. So they're this institution that goes into families' homes, goes into Jewish and interfaith families' homes once a month, sends them a book. You can do what you want with that book. Families, toss it aside, right? But some of them, a large percentage of those folks, take it into their homes. And as the name PJ Library is like for PJ like pajamas, not everybody makes that leap. You're supposed to read it to your kids. You're supposed to read these books to your kids at bedtime. That is like a wildly vulnerable moment. I'm not a parent, but parents tell me that is the moment when you are exhausted, right? You are so tired. And here is this organization coming in and saying, look, here's the right book for you. And here, in fact, are some instructions for how to talk to your kids about this. Here are the values that we think that you and your kids should be getting to this. They are shaping American Jewish families. They are deliberately shaping American Jewish families, and they've done their own quantitative research. They've done their own studies, we know for a fact that they are shaping American Jewish families. Their goal is to, for better or for worse, their goal is to get families who are not yet involved in mainstream Jewish organizations, like synagogues, like religious schools, and get them pulled in, right? The books are supposed to be the gateway drug to synagogues. They say this pretty explicitly. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I do think they're thinking especially about interfaith families, folks who, might have one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, and like, what's happening with them, right? Well, let's suck them into synagogues, right? They are reshaping American Jewish families. They're also reshaping the American Jewish children's book publication scene, which is a different conversation. I won't get into that now, but I just think we have evidence that they're reshaping the American Jewish family dramatically.
I can say as a parent that is indeed a vulnerable moment, and the PJ Library books do come in hand quite frequently, and some of them are favorites in my own home. So I'm compelled by your argument, and I'd like to subscribe to your newsletter, or at least to read your book. So, all right, let me give you some questions that we have emerging here. So one question says, my mother's family came from Eastern Europe and were devout communists and socialists, and that was a big part of my engaged Jewish childhood in the 1950s, parallel to the Orthodox world of my father's family. How does the anti-religious Jewish culture of the 20th century look to you now?
I love that question. So I'm not entirely sure whether the questioner means, what do I make of these anti-religious folks, or how do I see their legacy today? But I think you're right that there are, the communists and socialists and other anti-religious folks are an important part of Jewish history. And I think there is, in fact, a lot of nostalgia for them. And I think that's part of the nostalgia that's closely related to the nostalgia I'm looking at, and especially nostalgia for labor activists, actually, which is an overlapping category with these communists and socialists. That when when the Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side, with which I began, tells their story, they actually tell a moment in their history of women labor activists coming into the synagogue and disrupting the services. And they tell that as a part of their history. So I think that the anti-religious and the religious is super closely tied together. And we know that for historians of the early 20th century tell us that these anti-religious folks were living among and closely interacting with more traditionally religious folks. In fact, literally disrupting their services. And the Eldridge Street Synagogue tells this story as a way to tell stories about women. So they're a traditionally Orthodox synagogue, and the dominant space is a men's space. And today they're still used by an Orthodox congregation. And men still do the central, exciting ritual parts of the service. And the problem is, that's fine. The problem is that it's also a museum, and most of their visitors are non-Orthodox, especially non-Orthodox Jews, who might have a problem with the way gender works in Orthodox Judaism. So to forestall this, to head this off, the Eldridge Street Synagogue is like, don't worry, we have an important story of women, of women's history, of women doing badass things in this space. So they're incorporating that. So today, I think there's a lot of nostalgia for this history. And I think over the course of the 20th century, this idea of like anti-religious gradually becomes things like spiritual but not religious folks. That's a lot of where we are today. And like many other religious studies scholars, I look at folks who identify as spiritual but not religious and say, hey, if I've got a broad definition of religion, if I think religion is finding meaning in your lives through important stories, spiritual but not religious folks look pretty darn religious to me. So thanks so much for that question, Elias.
So Elias types, thank you for the answer. I miss the organized anti-religious part of the Jewish world. And then it just disappeared. So, which made him be an activist, a political activist in the 1960s. So thank you. Another question here asks, how does traditional Jewish religious stories, such as the Exodus out of Egypt or the Hanukkah story, fit into modern Jewish religious nostalgic Jewish practice for Jews who do not identify as religious?
Great question. So I'm going to reframe that a little bit. How's the nostalgia that I'm looking at working with traditional religious practices is I think what some of this questioner is asking. And, I think the stuff that I'm looking at is building on traditional religious stories. So if we think about, I mentioned the Passover, and this attendee mentions the Passover Seder, when Jews say, we came out of Egypt, and tell the story, more or less, of the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and they're imagining emotionally that they were there. They're supposed to. They might get distracted by like getting hungry for dinner. And I think that's a great model for the stuff that I'm looking at. And I think also we're not just, there are these narratives, these traditional religious narratives of nostalgia and of emotion, but also anybody who practices a holiday has their own family memories or has their own memories of their own practices, right? We're not just nostalgic for Hanukkah in general, we're nostalgic for our childhood Hanukkahs. And we're nostalgic for the Hanukkah that we learned that our father practiced, right? Or whatever. And I think that these family stories and these community stories and these big grand narratives all get mixed together emotionally. And that's some of what I'm thinking about through my book. And I think those emotions get tapped in by, as this person says, by folks who, aren't religious. There's a lot to say about Hanukkah and folks who aren't religious. Even Passover is the holiday most engaged with by any kind of Jew. If you're gonna practice a holiday, it's probably going to be Passover. But I think that, these folks who aren't religious can think about or engage with their family stories about these holidays, and they can also think about and practice their communal histories through any of the nostalgic activities that I'm thinking about. Thanks.
Another question here is, do you believe that we can finally recognize the smicha, or the rabbinic ordination, of traditionally lay leaders and community members? Because you were talking about how you think these people should be considered religious leaders.
Oh my goodness. What an amazing question. Just in case everybody doesn't know, smicha is ordination of rabbis. That is fascinating. I think, I'm just the person who gets to comment on all of this. I don't actually tell Jews what to do. If I were in charge, a lot of things might be done differently. Love that idea. I also wonder if formalizing leadership in this way would change their roles completely, right? So I think that's a great thought experiment, and I love the question. Thank you for asking it.
I also find compelled by that question as well, and we'll be thinking about that. Okay, there's another question here. You mentioned the sense of nostalgia regarding historical institutions, and the discussion of the prayer shawl made me think about the religious sense that comes out of heirlooms. Do you think there's a sense of religion that comes out of heirlooms alongside institutions? And the person who asked this question, we should make known, is one of your students.
Bless you, Catherine. Thank you for coming and for asking a question. You can probably guess that my answer, you've spent enough time with me that you probably know that, yeah, I think heirlooms are such a great example in general of something we might not think about as religious, but hold, I would call them religious. If we have this really broad definition of religion, something that helps us form meaningful or even sacred relationships, and something that helps us understand, like existentially understand our place in the world, heirlooms do those things, right? If I inherit a locket from my I did not inherit a locket from my grandmother. I did inherit earrings from my grandmother. And, they make me think of her. They make me think of my mother. They make me think of the family stories. They might make me think of where my grandmother's family came from. And in wearing them, not these earrings, these are new, in wearing them, or, even just keeping them in a box and thinking about them, I'm placing myself in a family story, and I might even be placing myself in a bigger and broader history, which is the work I'm thinking about when I think about nostalgia as religious. Thanks so much for asking that, Catherine, and thanks for coming.
Yes, thank you indeed for asking and for coming. How wonderful to have students coming from San Francisco State as well as USF. It's a nice partnership. Why do you think the existential crisis of Jewish identity persists despite the flourishing Jewish life that exists outside predominantly religious observant spaces?
Okay, I'm going to reframe this just a little, and I think the questioner might be asking, thank you, Stephen, for asking this. I think you might be asking, I don't believe that there is an existential crisis. I think that people keep talking about an existential crisis, right? I hope I made clear, I don't think Judaism's in decline, and it sounds like you don't think Judaism's in decline either. Jewish life is, as you say, flourishing outside of predominantly religious spaces. American Jews are doing fine. Why do people keep worrying about this? Well, there are a couple folks I would turn to answer that. One of them is the historian Lila Corwin Berman, who writes about how, and as well as work she's done with the historians Ronit Stahl, who's over at Berkeley, and Katie Rosenblatt. And together they have written about how American Jews were convinced by Jewish sociologists that the best way to understand American Jews is through counting them and through doing sociological surveys. And that particular types of sociologists, I'm sorry, this is the moment where I, as a historian, throw sociologists under, well, actually I'm a religious studies scholar, but I'm a humanist, and I throw social scientists under the bus. Not all social scientists, but certain types of Jewish sociologists have encouraged American Jews to focus on numbers and counting Jews. And I think that's really limited the ways that we think about American Judaism. So I think this is the thing where, the truth probably lies somewhere between social sciences and the humanities, between quantitative and qualitative work. And if we look at all of this work together, we're going to find a lot more expressions of Jewish life. So if we look beyond the surveys, which are constructed in a particular way to get, if you ask certain questions, you're going to get certain answers, right? And you're also, if you're going to do big surveys, you're going to be kind of limited in the kind of answers that you can get. So I think, in short, I think the existential crisis has, or the idea of an existential American Jewish crisis has continued because of who has been allowed to be seen as authoritative in American Jewish communities. Who are we listening to? And who are our leaders, our community leaders, our rabbis and other folks? Who have they been listening to? So maybe they should be listening to me.
I'll agree with you on that. Thank you for responding to that and pointing to those very important scholars doing remarkable work as well. Okay, a few more questions with the time we have left. Is the way Ashkenazi Jews show nostalgic devotion to their homes in Eastern Europe similar to how Jews in general feel nostalgic towards ancient Israel?
Great question. Absolutely, and maybe. So we have this idea of the Jewish diaspora, that once upon a time, ancient Israelites and Judeans lived in the land of Israel. And ever since more or less at least since, the fall of the Second Temple in 70 CE, destroyed by the Romans, Jews have lived around the world. They were actually living around the world before that. And since then, Jews have included in their prayers, literally praying, traditional prayers include, return us to Zion, which is another word for Jerusalem or the land of Israel. Return us. There's a sense of longing in the prayers for the land of Israel. And so is that the same thing as the nostalgia I'm looking at? I think it's certainly related. It might mean that American Jews, it might be one reason that American Jews are interested in longing for homelands. I also think we might think about the ways that Central and Eastern Europe, for a lot of Jews, has actually replaced the land of Israel, right? American Jews don't think of their actual homeland, for the most part, as the land of Israel, right? That thing that their ancestors might or might not have lived in thousands of years ago. They think about their homeland as Central and Eastern Europe. So many of them. So they might think about that it might have replaced it. It might be related because it replaced it. It's different also because it's not in liturgy, right? It's not the thing that they do in synagogue. It's not the thing they do ritually on holidays. It's the thing that they feel, that they are encouraged to feel through children's books, through delis, through their leisure activities. So it's really different in different ways. And I'm absolutely drawing a parallel, but I also want to think about the ways in which it's different. It's something that's more commercial and more institutionalized. And I think, we can think about commerce and institutions as, again, important sites of religion. Thanks so much for that important question.
How might we think about the role of the synagogue, with synagogues struggling to keep their doors open and attract new members?
It's a great question. Thank you. Actually, since I've written this book, I've been a little bit interested. It's been interesting to me how my book is literally called, literally called Beyond the Synagogue. I'm like, hey, guys, let's literally look beyond the synagogue for religion. And what's been really interesting to me and a little bit surprising is how many folks who are leaders of synagogues have turned to me and say, hey, how can we incorporate what the stuff you're looking at in synagogues? So, I'm not a synagogue leader. So I think there are a lot of folks who know that better than I do. And I actually think synagogues are, I think it varies by synagogue to synagogue, but I see synagogue life flourishing in a lot of different ways. A lot of folks are somehow getting it right. And, I think they're getting it right by being inclusive, especially of interfaith families, of non-white folks who might be members, folks with different economic situations and different ages, and somehow working to incorporate all those folks and build a community. That's really hard work. And I really admire the folks who are doing it well. And some of the ways that they're building community is by, I think, looking at these institutions that I'm looking at, right? By doing genealogy workshops, by, serving deli and thinking about food, having workshops on food, by building synagogues in the United States have incorporated a lot of different activities, different leisure activities for a really long time. Arguably, as long as there have been synagogues in the United States since the colonial era. One of the colonial synagogues had a wine club. So I don't know, that sounds to me like I would join a wine club if a synagogue started one. Yeah, so they can look to to these supposedly secular institutions. But I also want us to think about where else can we look for Jewish life beyond synagogues. So thanks so much for that question.
I'm also compelled by looking for Jewish religious and cultural life beyond the synagogue. And I'm so grateful to you for writing this book again and opening up space for it. I'd like to ask one final question, which is to ask, how did you come to this project and this research in the first place? Because it's a really compelling question, and wonder sort of what your personal attachment is to it, and how this became a key part of your research.
Thank you for that question, Oren. So I was a Jewish studies major in college. Shout out to those Jewish studies majors and minors who are here with us. When I came to college, I thought being a Jewish studies major was like the dumbest thing I'd ever heard of. The Jewish studies major at the University of Virginia had just started, and my dad was like, "You should do that." And I was like, "Absolutely not. That's majoring in being a Jew is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of." And I had registered as a Jewish studies major by the end of the semester, or by the end of my first year in college, when I learned it was not a major in how to be a Jew. I could be a Jew any way I liked, but it was a major in studying Jews. And I just thought that was the most interesting thing I'd ever heard of. My teacher, Vanessa Oakes, introduced herself as an anthropologist of Jews. And I was like, oh my God, you can do that? Like, I want to grow up to be that. So I didn't grow up to be an anthropologist, but I am a religious studies professor who studies living Jews. I wrote my master's thesis on museums that were used as synagogues, and that led to a chapter of this book. And, you know, the whole time I was writing this book, and in a lot of my research, I really, actually, I know at USF, you guys wonderfully encourage your students to bring their whole selves to their studies. And I try to do that sometimes as well in my own classes. I love when students bring their whole selves, but as a scholar, I'm often a little bit reticent, especially as a person who studies living people. You don't want to impose, if you're studying living people, if you're interacting with them and observing them, you don't want to bring yourself too much. Anthropologists think a lot about the ways to bring themselves, but my tendency is that I want to be careful about it, actually, because if I present myself in a certain way, people are going to respond to me in a certain way. It's going to limit and shape their answers to me in a certain way. So I want to be really careful about that, about how I present myself and the ways in which I present myself as open to their answers, which I am. It's my job to listen to their answers. And one way, I'm going to tell you one way, I don't normally tell this story, special for USF and this recording. One way that my Jewish identity came into this research, this is not in the book, my research on delis is mostly about artisanal delis. Most delis in the United States, especially artisanal delis, are not kosher. They do not follow traditional Jewish dietary laws. This is not something I usually reveal to my students either, but I do keep kosher. I do keep traditional Jewish dietary laws, which for me means a lot of things. One of which is that I eat in restaurants that are not kosher, but I only eat vegetarian in them. I don't eat non-kosher meat. So I was researching meat restaurants that focus on meat. I'm not eating any of the meat. So I researched all of these wonderful restaurants that have like artisanal, local, sustainable meat. Like it's like grass-fed and like the best beef, you know? Didn't eat any of it, which is like really sad for me, actually. And also I generally, unless somebody asked me directly, I generally didn't tell them that I kept kosher. I usually just told them I was vegetarian, because if I told them that I kept kosher, they might think of me in a certain way. They might limit their answers. They might or might not get defensive, right? They might think, oh, she keeps kosher, she's going to be judging me for not keeping kosher. And their answers might change substantially. So in doing this research, I had to be really careful about the way I presented my Jewish identity and the way that it came into interacting with this research. But it was so much fun, and I learned so much from all the folks that I studied, and I really, really thank them for their openness and their willingness to talk to me.
Yeah, well, we who have listened to you tonight and learned with you tonight, and those of us who have and will read the book, are also grateful to them for speaking to you, because we got a very brilliant and compelling chapter. I want to say that if you are a USF student and you have found this to be interesting and compelling in any way, these are precisely the conversations we have in the Jewish Studies and Social Justice minor. I encourage you to consider doing something similar to what Professor Gross did, which is to major. Well, you can't major, but you can minor in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at USF. It's an interdisciplinary minor. It's intersectional. We focus on marginalized communities. We have robust conversations about unique and various and diverse ways of being Jewish, religiously, culturally, ethnically, so on and so forth. And we will, in our classes, continue these types of conversations. So that's my shameless plug for USF students. And I want to thank you so much, Professor Gross, for spending time with us tonight, for being so open and forthcoming, and for writing this truly groundbreaking and remarkable book. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. Have a wonderful night.